Welcome to Literary Insights. This is the summary of the book Set Boundaries, Find Peace, Nedra Tawwab. If you like this content, please consider subscribing and liking this video. In the link in the description, you will find the link to purchase the book, but do not buy it before watching this video to see if it is good for you or not. The book is described as the boundary Bible that teaches not just how to set healthy boundaries but how to be clear about feelings and intentions. This is needed to find peace. It is called the most comprehensive, relevant and relatable guide to setting boundaries, speaking your needs and living a more peaceful life. The book offers clarity and direction on setting boundaries, a topic often discussed but rarely integrated. It is said to help with living in alignment and shifting relationships with self and others. It is praised for breaking down the what, why and how of boundaries in a clear and compassionate way, leaving readers confident, empowered and prepared to have difficult conversations. Without healthy boundaries, fully living the life you want is difficult. The book provides a powerful roadmap for establishing expectations and limits to live with safety, respect and self-actualization. It is an eye-opening and thoroughly engaging book on fully realizing your potential by clearly setting healthy boundaries in personal, professional and relationship life. Readers who follow the author on social media and struggle with boundaries will appreciate the advice in the book. Here is a summary of the provided text. The author uses Kim's story to illustrate how neglecting boundaries by constantly saying yes to help others can lead to feeling overwhelmed, stressed, and anxious. The author defines boundaries as expectations and needs that help one feel safe and comfortable in relationships. Setting boundaries through saying no is important for mental and emotional well-being. Signs of poor boundaries include neglecting self-care, constantly feeling overwhelmed, resentment, avoidance, and other mental health issues. When people focus only on helping others and don't carve out time for themselves, it shows a lack of boundaries. Self-care is more than just pampering, it's about setting boundaries by saying no sometimes in order to say yes to one's own needs. Putting self-care first, like with an oxygen mask analogy, allows one to have more energy for others. The root cause of many mental health issues seen in therapy is related to poor boundaries. The author helps clients identify where they need to set healthier boundaries to reduce stress, anxiety, and feelings of being overwhelmed. Boundaries are important for maintaining well-being and healthy relationships. A lack of boundaries can lead to feelings of resentment, avoidance, and being overwhelmed. Common signs that better boundaries are needed include feeling overwhelmed, resentful towards others, avoiding interactions where help may be asked for, feeling burned out with no time for oneself. There are three types of boundaries: porous, weak boundaries lead to depletion, rigid boundaries create distance through walls, and healthy boundaries involve clear communication and awareness of one's needs and limits. Setting boundaries has two parts: communicating your needs verbally through assertive statements, and then upholding what you said through your actions and behavior. Understanding boundaries is essential for defining roles in relationships, communicating acceptable/unacceptable behaviors, and feeling safe and respected. Boundaries may change over time and situations. Having healthy boundaries means being comfortable saying no without apology when needed, and hearing no without taking it personally, while still maintaining appropriate vulnerability. Setting boundaries in relationships can often lead to pushback, limit testing, questioning, defensiveness, or other resistance from the other person. This is a normal reaction as boundaries represent a change. It is important to communicate boundaries clearly but also take action to reinforce them when they are violated. Simply stating a boundary without follow-through may lead to the other person ignoring it. Common responses to setting boundaries include pushback, limit testing, ignoring the boundary, rationalizing/questioning the request, becoming defensive, ghosting/disappearing, or giving the silent treatment. When faced with these responses, it is important to restate the boundary clearly, focus on how certain behaviors make you feel, avoid justifying yourself, and address issues promptly rather than letting things fester. Keeping communications brief and centered on your own feelings/needs can help minimize defensiveness from the other party. How the other person reacts provides information but shouldn't determine whether you uphold the boundary for your own well-being and the health of the relationship going forward. Having and enforcing boundaries is part of maintaining mutual respect. Erica is a single mother of two daughters, ages 7 and 9, and works full-time as an accountant. She has very limited help from her daughter's father. She feels pressure to be the perfect mother, working full-time, driving her daughters to all their activities, maintaining the household, etc. with little help or support. This year during her busy tax season, the heavy workload and expectations became too much. Basic household tasks started piling up as she struggled to maintain everything. She based her view of motherhood on seeming expectations of other mothers around her doing it all without help. But not having good boundaries led to overwhelm and burnout. The key lessons are that trying to do everything alone without support or boundaries is unsustainable and will lead to stress, overwhelm, and eventual burnout. It's important to ask for and accept help when needed. Erica was experiencing burnout from trying to do it all as a working mother. She was always on her phone and late, and the kids ate frozen meals since she wasn't cooking. She felt she couldn't be a good employee and mom at the same time. At home, she had unrealistic expectations of herself and no support system. She felt her job as a mom was thankless. This led her to withdraw emotionally from her kids and friends. In therapy, Erica realized she directed her anger at her ex-husband toward her kids. She started taking small steps like hiring help and asking for more support. This allowed her to set healthier boundaries and prevent total burnout. Burnout occurs when people don't set boundaries, overcommit, prioritize others over themselves, strive for perfection, don't ask for help, and lack appreciation. Managing burnout requires recognizing limits, delegating tasks, and cultivating self-care habits. With support, Erica was able to balance her responsibilities better. Mental health issues like anxiety, depression, dependent personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, substance use disorders, and eating disorders can all impact a person's ability to establish and maintain healthy boundaries. For anxiety sufferers, saying no and setting limits is challenging due to a fear of negative outcomes. Unrealistic expectations and people-pleasing behaviors can also trigger anxiety. Slowly practicing small acts of boundary setting, like asking for order corrections, can help. For those with depression, taking on too many tasks sets oneself up for failure and increased depressive symptoms. Focusing on small wins and limiting daily commitments aids in boundary setting. Those with dependent personality disorder struggle greatly with being alone and rely heavily on others for decision-making due to an inability to set boundaries. Borderline personality disorder causes unstable relationships due to a lack of boundaries. It's difficult to differentiate self from others. Relationships without clear communication of boundaries tend to be one-sided, dysfunctional, and unhealthy. Both overly rigid and porous boundaries can be problematic. Self-care is also difficult without establishing limits. It's important to talk to yourself with kindness and treat yourself well, as others take cues from how you treat yourself. Common feelings that arise when we don't set healthy boundaries include resentment, anger, and frustration. Our bodies also signal when boundaries are being violated through physical tension, pain, etc. Some common reasons these feelings emerge are feeling unheard, not gaining desired results from boundaries, committing to things we don't want to do, and feeling used. We may avoid setting boundaries through passive-aggressive means like gossiping or complaining instead of direct communication. We may also avoid by physically removing ourselves, avoiding confrontations, or abruptly cutting people off without explanation. Exercises like identifying all our responsibilities can help determine what needs to be eliminated to prioritize things we enjoy and find meaningful. Childhood trauma and neglect can make setting boundaries uniquely challenging, as we may have taken on caregiver roles too early or had blurry family boundaries growing up. It's important to understand why we struggle with boundaries to strengthen them. They quickly opened up to him refers to Justin opening up to the therapist. Justin had a pattern of caring for others' needs while neglecting his own. He was emotionally neglected as a child during his parents' divorce. This led him to have difficulty setting boundaries and establishing healthy relationships as an adult. Initially, Justin was uncomfortable sharing about his own feelings and needs with the therapist. However, over time as they focused on helping Justin set emotional boundaries with his family and improve communication, he began to open up more about himself. He started trusting that others wanted to understand his perspective and support him. When children set boundaries around food preferences or who they want physical affection from, parents should honor those boundaries by offering alternatives rather than insisting or punishing. This teaches children their boundaries are respected. Modeling is important. Children learn about boundaries by observing how parents respond when boundaries are set with them. Traumatic experiences like abuse, neglect, trauma can impair a person's ability to set boundaries as they may feel responsible for the negative actions of others or believe survival depends on not setting boundaries. Emotional neglect, like relying on a child for emotional support or adult responsibilities, violates boundaries and harms development. Thought patterns like fearing being rude, prioritizing people-pleasing, or anxiety about future interactions can prevent effectively setting boundaries. Overall, respecting children's boundaries is important for healthy development and teaches them it is acceptable to have preferences and limits. The passage discusses different types of boundaries that people can set in relationships, including emotional, physical, financial, time/energy, and privacy boundaries. It acknowledges that setting boundaries can be uncomfortable but is important for maintaining healthy relationships and self-care. Common fears around setting boundaries include feeling mean, rude, disliked by others, awkward in future interactions, or powerless. Effective boundary setting requires being clear on what is acceptable versus unacceptable behavior, stating boundaries respectfully, accepting that others may not agree with the boundaries, and following through consistently. An example is given of a client named Alex who had trouble with emotional boundaries. She overshared personal details and expected the same level of disclosure from others very quickly, which overwhelmed some friends. The types of boundaries discussed can help people identify specific areas to improve in their relationships and personal lives. Managing discomfort is part of the process of setting boundaries. Reframing negative thoughts about boundaries can also help make the process less difficult. Alex had difficulty discussing her feelings in depth during therapy sessions and maintaining healthy relationships with friends. She was used to her father telling her every detail about her family life, including her mother's affair, from a young age. However, he was dismissive of her feelings and told her how to think rather than listen. Alex relied heavily on her father for opinions and advice as she did not trust herself to make decisions. This damaged her self-esteem. She also overshared personal details with friends, constantly seeking validation. This overwhelmed them and caused them to distance themselves, though Alex did not realize she was violating their boundaries. Through therapy, Alex learned about different types of boundaries, including physical, sexual, intellectual, emotional, material, and time. She worked on identifying her own feelings, making independent decisions, and improving how she shares details of her life appropriately with others. Here is a summary of the key points about setting boundaries. Setting material boundaries involves stating clear expectations for how possessions will be treated when loaned to others, such as due dates, conditions of return, and consequences for damage. Examples given were expecting a full loan repayment by Friday or charging a dry cleaning fee for a stained suit. Time boundaries involve managing your own time, how others use your time, dealing with requests, and structuring free time. Examples given were being unavailable to stay late or chat during working hours. Common time boundary violations include overcommitting, not filtering calls/texts when busy, long draining conversations, and accepting favors without reciprocity. To maintain time boundaries, one should check calendars before committing and allow communications to wait if busy. The passage discusses micro versus macro boundary violations. Micro violations are more subtle and occur in everyday encounters, while macro violations are persistent and erode relationships over time. Examples of both types of violations involving communication, decision-making, managing others' problems, and taking responsibility for others' issues are provided. Microaggressions are also discussed as subtle negative behaviors that communicate negativity, whether intentionally or not. Examples related to race, gender, sexual orientation are given. Here is a summary of the key points about microaggressions and ways to address them. Microaggressions are subtle, everyday expressions of biases and prejudices that can be harmful and offensive. They often appear harmless on the surface but have deeper underlying issues. Examples given include body shaming, racial biases making assumptions based on race, gender bias treating women as bossy, and LGBTQ bias making assumptions about sexuality. Ways to address microaggressions include directly but assertively pointing out what was perceived as offensive, and suggesting more appropriate behavior. Oversharing involves disclosing inappropriate, private, or overly personal information. The oversharer may be clueless about boundaries and seek connection. Examples given range from inappropriate work discussions to revealing private info. Ways to handle oversharing include gently redirecting, asserting the conversation should happen privately later, or saying you're not equipped to help in that situation. Guilt trips involve intentionally making someone feel bad to manipulate their behavior. Examples are guilting someone out of ending toxic relationships or lacking interest in certain people. Ways to address guilt trips include calling it out, making the conversation about your own preferences, and declaring your decision is made. Big B macroaggressions disrupt relationships long-term through issues like enmeshment, codependency, trauma bonding, and counterdependency. Enmeshment lacks boundaries and individual identity, while codependency involves enabling unhealthy behaviors in others. Boundaries are important to address these issues. Codependency pertains to any relationship where one person's emotional well-being depends on another person. It involves excessive caretaking behavior and lacking proper boundaries. Enabling is a key part of codependency, where someone supports another person's unhealthy behaviors through actions or inactions. Codependent behaviors include overextending oneself for others, avoiding problems, cleaning up others' messes, making excuses, prioritizing others' needs over one's own, being the rescuer, etc. Codependency often stems from poor self-esteem, control issues, and a need for approval. Both people in the relationship end up suffering as their own needs go unmet. Trauma bonding occurs when boundary violations lead someone to believe they deserve mistreatment. It involves blaming oneself, excusing poor behavior, feeling unable to leave toxic relationships. Counterdependency is developing rigid boundaries as a reaction, impairing the ability to be vulnerable and connect with others. Healthy boundaries are important to establish in relationships to avoid codependency, trauma bonding, or counterdependency. Clear communication of one's boundaries is also important. Eric's discussions with his father Paul always revolved around Paul and ensuring he was taking care of himself. Paul frequently repeated the same stories. Occasionally Paul would call Eric in a rage and become verbally abusive. Eric did not understand what prompted these outbursts. As Eric's mother continued making excuses for Paul's behavior, Eric's relationship with her deteriorated as he could not confide in her. Trying to help his father was weighing on Eric. He had not tried setting boundaries directly with his parents. The passage discusses different ineffective ways of communicating boundaries: passive, aggressive, passive-aggressive, and manipulative. Eric's behavior towards his father was mostly passive-aggressive. He complained to his mother but did not directly address issues with Paul. Assertiveness is posited as the healthiest way to communicate boundaries directly and clearly state one's needs without attacking others. Here is a summary of the key points in the situation. Eric had been struggling to set healthy boundaries with his family members, especially his father, mother, and brother. He felt guilty about enforcing limits but knew it was important for his well-being. He started by setting a boundary with his mother, telling her not to defend Eric's father when Eric brings up issues with him. This helped improve their relationship. Eric also set a boundary with his brother, asking him to stop picking fights with their father at family gatherings. They had a good conversation about how their father's drinking had impacted them both. The most difficult boundary for Eric would be with his father. He feared his father may yell or get angry. However, he realized his father did respect some rules and boundaries in other contexts. Eric decided to start by telling his father not to call when drunk. The next week, when his father violated this boundary by calling drunk, Eric enforced the limit by reiterating he only wants to talk when his father is sober. So in summary, Eric was working to establish healthier boundaries in his family relationships, starting with his mother and brother, and was preparing to enforce a limit with his difficult father around drinking and behavior. Eric tried to set a boundary with his dad by telling him not to call when drunk. However, his dad became defensive, denied being drunk, and questioned Eric's right to say anything about what he does. Eric was confused about how to proceed after this confrontation. Common responses when people try to set boundaries include pushback, ignoring the boundary, testing limits, rationalizing/questioning the boundary, becoming defensive, and giving the silent treatment. It's important to decide how you will respond if the person violates the boundary, such as firmly restating it. Don't take violations personally as the other person wants to do what they want. Allow an acclimation period for people to adjust to the new boundaries, as this is an adjustment for both people. Use I statements like I want, I need, I expect to clearly communicate boundaries. Follow through by upholding the boundaries yourself and deciding what actions to take if they are violated. Avoid apologizing, wavering, or giving too many details when setting boundaries. Be clear, direct, and consistent. Common reasons boundaries may not be respected include not upholding them yourself, not speaking firmly, being inconsistent, or not following through on consequences. Quick tips include speaking up in the moment and not letting violations slide. Chloe had a close relationship with her brother, raised children from his first marriage, but he forced her to cut ties with them during his divorce proceedings. Chloe felt Ray was self-centered and narcissistic. He would complain to Chloe about many issues in his life that were often his own fault. Chloe blamed their mother for spoiling Ray as a child and letting him get away with tantrums. As adults, their mother still favored Ray. Chloe felt used by Ray as he would frequently ask to borrow money or vent to her. She felt guilty if she didn't answer his calls. Chloe tried to set boundaries by saying no to loans, but would end up giving in. She was worried not helping Ray would deprive his children. Chloe sought therapy to understand why her boundaries failed and question the relationship. She disclosed concerns to her mother, but nothing changed. Chloe realized she needed to directly set boundaries with Ray by reducing contact and saying a simple no without explanation when he asked for things. She also needed to address boundaries with her enabling mother. The statement says that if the person does not work late tonight, the requester will not give them the time off that they had previously requested. It is giving an ultimatum: work late tonight or lose your requested time off. Trauma in childhood, such as abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction, can impact one's ability to set and maintain healthy boundaries as an adult. Amber experienced trauma like neglect from her mother, sexual abuse by a boyfriend, and instability living with different family members. Her ACE score was high at 8/10. As an adult, Amber rigidly kept people at a distance through things like cutting off relationships abruptly, avoiding emotional intimacy, and not allowing partners to meet her family. Her trauma was resurfacing after her father's death, causing emotional flooding and distress. It became clear her boundaries were a way to avoid dealing with traumatic memories and feelings from childhood. With therapy, Amber began connecting how her current emotional state related to past trauma, and learning healthy boundaries can help process trauma and facilitate relationships instead of avoidance. Her resistance decreased as she reframed therapy as simply wanting to feel better. There are 3 types of common boundary violations due to trauma: physical, sexual, and emotional. Examples are provided for each type. Adults who experienced childhood abuse or neglect may struggle with codependency, low self-esteem, people-pleasing, difficulty regulating emotions, and enmeshed relationships. Unhealthy attachment styles like anxious and avoidant attachment can impact one's boundaries in relationships. Characteristics of each style are described. Experiencing trauma can lead to shame, guilt, fear of vulnerability, and difficulty communicating boundaries. Keeping family trauma secret can also impact this. Different trauma scenarios are provided as examples of how they may influence one's ability to speak up, share feelings, and set boundaries. Self-care is important for those who experience trauma. Taking care of one's mental health and learning how to ask for needs are part of healthy self-care. It is possible to work through issues related to trauma and change attachment styles or boundaries with awareness and commitment to changing behaviors. Understanding another's perspective can also help relationships. When working with someone who has experienced trauma, it's important not to try to do the work for them by enabling them. This undermines their agency and ability to heal. Instead, communicate what you observe respectfully and refer them to a mental health professional who can provide appropriate treatment and support. Asking reflective questions can also help the person gain insight, but it's not your role to try to fix them or take over their healing process. The goal is to support them as they do the work. Honoring boundaries is important for one's own healing after trauma. Exercises like journaling can help a person identify how their trauma has impacted their ability to set boundaries and reassure themselves that it's okay to implement necessary limits. Overall, the approach is compassionate observation and referral rather than enabling or trying to do the therapeutic work yourself. The person needs to take ownership of their healing with professional help. The passage discusses setting boundaries in relationships to prevent others from taking advantage. It's important to communicate clearly how you want to be treated and enforce consequences when boundaries are violated. Examples are given of interpersonal boundaries like not allowing people to yell, addressing issues directly rather than passively, and correcting untrue statements about yourself. Self-boundaries discussed include speaking kindly to oneself, allowing mistakes without harsh judgment, and not using self-deprecating language. Relationship boundaries include choosing partners who treat you well, speaking up when issues arise, and reflecting on what attracts certain problematic people. Upholding boundaries requires following through with consequences if violations occur, even with family. It's also important to say no more often and tell people to stop asking after an initial no. Setting boundaries with oneself includes rules that promote goals, health, and avoiding self-sabotage through procrastination or negative self-talk. Keeping commitments to oneself is important. James was caught in the middle of disputes between his wife Tiffany and mother Deborah. Tiffany resented that James did not set boundaries with his mother and would not stand up to her. Deborah was overbearing and passive-aggressive, always inserting herself into James and Tiffany's decisions. James relied on his mother financially and sought her input and approval for many things. In therapy, James initially defended his mother while Tiffany expressed issues with Deborah's interference. The therapist refocused them on their own needs. They established boundaries around not oversharing with others and keeping some discussions private between them. This was difficult for James, who was used to sharing everything with his mother. James started implementing boundaries with his mother consistently, while Tiffany used supportive language to encourage James as he shifted this dynamic. The goal was for James to maintain the integrity of his marriage by setting healthy boundaries with his mother. The man struggled to establish himself as an independent adult in his relationship with his mother, Deborah. She had instilled in him from a young age that she knew best and always wanted what was best for him. He feared that setting boundaries with her would push her away or cause issues in their close relationship. He hadn't considered that it was possible to set boundaries with his mother while still maintaining closeness. Doing so could help address problems in his marriage and tension between his mother and wife. His mother's intentions of wanting the best for him led her to be over-involved and interfere in his adult life. Perhaps what was best for him was learning to set boundaries with her. Becoming a truly independent adult requires establishing boundaries with one's parents to take control of one's own life and decisions. This can be difficult due to parents' desire to maintain influence and a child's fear of disapproval, but it is important for healthily transitioning to adulthood. It's important for partners to respect each other's boundaries with their family members, especially parents. Communicating needs and coming to agreements supports the relationship. Sharing too much personal information with parents can make the partner feel left out. The partner's support should be prioritized over sharing with parents. Setting boundaries with in-laws respectfully is okay if the partner is not supporting the needed boundaries. Siblings, extended family, and other relatives may also need boundaries around issues like interference, gossip, judgment, or enmeshment. Creating distance and asserting independence supports healthy relationships. Co-parenting requires boundaries like not speaking negatively about the other parent to children, resolving disputes respectfully, and prioritizing the children's well-being over parental conflicts and disagreements. Children need consistency, age-appropriate limits, structure, and to be shielded from inappropriate adult issues. This teaches them how to regulate themselves and maintain boundaries as they grow. The key idea is that boundaries respect relationships and priorities while supporting independence, respect, and healthy dynamics for all involved. Communication, agreement, and gentle enforcement of boundaries between partners and family members is important. The passage discusses the importance of children being able to set healthy boundaries with adults by expressing small requests, like asking the adult to stop criticizing another family member, listen to the child, not force physical contact like hugs, spend more focused time with the child, or stop engaging with someone who is mean to the child. It's important for adults to listen to these types of requests from children and honor their boundaries when possible. Setting boundaries helps children feel safe and respected. Setting boundaries with family can be particularly challenging since families are used to people playing certain roles. But improving boundaries can lead to better relationships. An exercise is suggested to get the reader to reflect on how they feel about setting boundaries with their family, who might be most and least receptive, and what specific boundaries they want to implement and how to ensure their family follows them. Having open and honest communication about boundaries and expectations is very important for a healthy relationship. These types of conversations should happen early on. Common areas where boundaries should be discussed include fidelity, finances, household responsibilities, plans for children, and handling outside influences like family. Assertive communication is better than passively allowing problems to persist. When issues come up, partners should clearly state their needs and how they want their needs to be met. An environment of open communication works best when small issues are addressed proactively before they become major problems. Little annoyances should still be brought up respectfully. When boundaries are violated, changing one's own behavior may be necessary to de-escalate tensions rather than demanding the other person change. Compromise is important. Relationships often face challenges during the first year of marriage, when children are born, and when children leave home. Extra communication and understanding is needed during those periods. Co-parenting styles also need alignment. Overall, proactively discussing expectations and needs, addressing issues respectfully, understanding each life phase, and finding compromise are keys for healthy long-term communication and boundaries within a relationship. The passage discusses balancing relationships with friends and setting boundaries when needed. It provides an example of Kevin, who dreads phone calls with his friend Dave because Dave spends the entire time complaining. Kevin finds the conversations draining but does not want to hurt Dave's feelings by speaking up. The author advises Kevin that setting boundaries, even if difficult at first, is important for his own well-being. They suggest ways for Kevin to steer conversations to more positive topics or reduce call time. Setting boundaries gets easier with practice. The passage notes friendship boundaries can be challenging because friends expect openness. However, not addressing issues allows problems to persist. Our relationships reflect our boundaries. While boundaries may upset friends initially, quality friendships can withstand them. The signs of a healthy friendship that allows for boundaries are outlined, versus signs of an unhealthy friendship where boundaries may be needed. Complaints can fall into venting, problem-solving or rumination categories. Rumination is repeatedly talking about issues without trying to solve them. Chronic complainers may ruminate frequently without limit. Friends get tired of listening to the same complaints. Ways to deal with chronic complainers include empathizing, redirecting conversation, leading by example, and setting boundaries around time and frequency of conversations. When not wanting to give advice, say you're unsure how to help or ask what the complainer has thought of doing. Refrain from giving opinions. Chronic complainers should be mindful of frequency and purpose of complaints. Journaling can help work through feelings. Friendships require boundary adjustments as life changes occur. Not all relationships survive changes, and some falling away is natural. Common boundary issues include being a relationship advisor, lending money/items, giving unsolicited advice, getting burned out from advice giving, receiving unsolicited advice, dealing with a needy friend. Friends are not therapists and should refer those needing expertise. Enmeshment in others' problems does not make one a good friend. Healthy boundaries are important. The passage discusses dealing with people who repeatedly violate boundaries, such as chronic gossips. It's important to set clear expectations and enforce consequences when boundaries are not respected. Relationships need to be ended if the other person refuses to accept one's boundaries over time. This is difficult but necessary for well-being. The passage outlines some signs that ending a relationship may be needed. Methods for ending relationships discussed include ghosting, slowly fading contact, or having a direct conversation. The best method depends on the situation and other people involved. Setting boundaries is also important at work. A story is given about a woman named Janine who felt overworked and frustrated by gossip at her job. Instead of quitting, she learned to directly say no and set limits on what she would take on. Common boundary issues that can arise at work are discussed, like taking on too much, not taking time off, and workplace interactions that cause stress. Boundaries are taught behaviors rather than common sense. Issues like harassment and abuse of power can violate boundaries if the workplace culture allows it. Overall health requires enforcing one's own boundaries even if others dismiss them. To feel like your job will be in jeopardy if you don't comply with toxic workplace behavior refers to the experience of fearing negative consequences, such as losing one's job, if they do not go along with or tolerate harmful, unethical, or illegal conduct in the workplace. Some key points. It creates pressure and fear for one's livelihood and financial security. Workers may feel forced to ignore poor treatment, boundaries being crossed, unsafe conditions, harassment, or other toxic behaviors out of self-preservation. Their ability to raise concerns or assert their rights is undermined by the implicit or explicit threat of retaliation like termination. It is a form of coercion that takes away employee agency and empowerment in the workplace. The toxic behaviors being enabled in this scenario could include bullying, hostility, discrimination, safety issues, overwork, or other forms of psychological or physical harm. So in summary, it refers to feeling obligated to accept toxicity due to legitimate concerns that objecting or resisting could cost one their means of income and employment. The fear undermines one's ability to set and demand healthy boundaries and standards in the workplace. Setting boundaries with technology and social media use is important for relationships and mental health. Spending too much time on phones or social media can detract from being present with others. Some signs you may need boundaries are constantly checking your phone when you should focus elsewhere, spending excessive time on your phone, using your phone to escape tasks or situations, and others complaining about your digital use. When managing social media as an influencer or public figure, it's important to remember some people will criticize no matter what. You can't please everyone and shouldn't try. Focus on protecting your energy. Explaining yourself constantly validates critics. To manage information overload, be selective about what accounts and content you engage with online. You have control over your own digital consumption. If something bothers you, move on rather than continuing to subject yourself to it. You have control over what media and websites you consume. Make intentional choices to minimize intake of bad news that negatively impacts your mental health. Set boundaries like turning off news alerts, limiting news consumption to certain times, unfollowing people who post negatively. On social media, it can be hard to unfollow friends and family, but it's okay to mute them if their posts upset you. Follow people whose content you genuinely enjoy. As an influencer or public figure, setting clear boundaries like not providing personal advice or responding to all messages can help manage interactions. Overuse of technology like excessive TV, social media, or checking phones can cause problems if it interferes with responsibilities. Consider boundaries like not keeping phones by the bed, putting phones out of reach, limiting social media time with tracking apps. Low self-esteem can come from envy of others' online lives. Unfollow if needed for mental well-being. Adults need to model good device behavior and be fully present with children instead of distracted by phones. Create boundaries around kids' device use, like not using phones during family meals or spending time together. Here is a summary of the key points around how devices can and should be used. Set boundaries like no devices at dinner, limiting screen time especially before bed, and monitoring social media usage. Use parental control apps to limit access to certain sites/features. Incorporate breaks when using devices to avoid prolonged screen time. Remove TVs from bedrooms to avoid late-night usage. Model good device habits for children by also limiting your own usage. Be aware of FOMO, fear of missing out, from overusing social media and seeing others' highlight reels. Discuss boundaries and expectations around social media usage with romantic partners to avoid privacy/trust issues. Consider taking breaks or cleanses from social media to avoid overuse and comparisons to others' posts. Implement strategies like limiting notifications, unfollowing unhelpful accounts, letting your phone die occasionally, and restricting access points to devices. The key is finding a balanced approach, setting clear expectations, leading by example, and prioritizing real human connection over constant screen time. Boundaries, moderation, and open communication are important for healthy device usage. Setting boundaries for the first time can feel uncomfortable and cause guilt, but it is important to push through that discomfort for your own health and well-being. Having boundaries doesn't mean you are being mean or wrong. Boundaries are a necessary part of healthy relationships and self-care. When setting boundaries, be clear and consistent. Know that others may push back or test your limits at first. Stay committed to your boundaries. Benefits of having boundaries include better sleep, less stress/burnout, and healthier relationships. Setting boundaries takes practice. Don't feel bad about yourself if you struggle at first. Stick with it and you will see positive changes. Common questions around setting boundaries with toxic family members, complaining friends, friends who refuse help, and saying no to loan requests are addressed. The general advice is to be direct but kind, focus on your own needs and limits, and suggest alternatives/resources to the other person. When setting boundaries with children, focus on explaining your reasoning with love and caring for their well-being too. Healthy boundaries provide structure and allow for growth. Here is a summary of the key points about setting structure for your child. Establish consistent routines and schedules for things like meals, sleep, homework, playtime, etc. This provides stability and predictability. Set clear rules and boundaries. Be firm about expectations and consequences while also explaining the reasons for rules. This teaches responsibility. Balance structure with free time for exploration and imagination. Unstructured play is important for development. Use positive reinforcement for good behavior rather than just punishment. Catch them being good and praise effort. Involve children in age-appropriate chores and responsibilities to build self-sufficiency. Limit screen time and prioritize offline activities like reading together, outdoor play, creative hobbies. Spend focused one-on-one time with each child daily through activities like playing, reading, or talking. Quality time is as important as quantity. Maintain open communication and be attentive to how your child is feeling. Structure provides security but must also allow emotional expression. Consistency is key. Enforce the structure gently but firmly across situations and over time so children learn self-regulation. Adjust expectations as they mature. I apologize, but I do not have enough context to summarize the article at that URL. The URL you provided does not seem to belong to any published content I am aware of summarizing. Could you please provide a brief overview of the article or find a publicly available summary instead of just the URL? Summarizing full articles based only on the URL risks misrepresenting the content without proper context. Depression can be linked to lack of boundaries, as seen in Erica's story of always saying yes and experiencing depression. Setting small boundaries like saying no sometimes can help overcome depression. DPD, dependent personality disorder, and codependency issues are related to problems with boundaries. Codependents often come from homes with few boundaries. Enmeshment, being overly involved in someone else's life, violates boundaries and autonomy. It is seen in family and romantic relationships especially. Setting boundaries can help address resentment, stress, and anxiety that comes from lack of boundaries. Consistency is important for honoring boundaries over time. Depression after ending a relationship is common as boundaries get readjusted. Affirmations and small boundaries can help. Friendships require boundaries around issues like oversharing, chronic complaining, giving unsolicited advice, lending money/possessions, and neediness. Family relationships often challenges boundaries with parents, in-laws, siblings, and co-parenting after divorce. Setting healthy holiday and social media boundaries is important. Romantic relationships benefit from communicating expectations, limits, and needs to avoid toxicity over time. Consent and each person's autonomy must be respected. Work-life balance requires time, communication, self-care, and priorities boundaries to avoid burnout. Saying no to extra tasks protects personal well-being. Honoring one's own boundaries regarding finances, self-care, reactions, privacy, and time management is empowering after neglect, abuse, or lack of boundaries in the past. Upholding boundaries respects the self. Here is a summary of the key points about boundaries in romantic relationships from the book. Overview of boundary challenges in romantic relationships includes addressing cheating/fidelity, co-parenting boundaries, difficult periods in the relationship, and the people you allow into your life. Setting healthy boundaries is important, such as establishing clear expectations, mutual understanding and agreement about boundaries, explicit and implicit relationship agreements. The first year of a relationship can be a difficult period when it comes to boundaries as expectations are still being set. Open communication is key. Examples of challenging but important boundary discussions include past relationships, future commitments, and financial matters. Habits like mindful communication, active listening, and spending quality time together help maintain healthy boundaries in a relationship. Unhealthy boundaries can include issues around control, codependency, lack of trust, or privacy between partners. Sexual boundaries within the relationship and with outside parties need clear definition and agreement between partners. Facing challenges openly and agreeing on solutions together helps the relationship withstand difficult periods around things like jealousy, schedules, or lifestyles. Maintaining close communication is important for understanding and respecting each partner's evolving needs over time. This includes discussing boundaries around things like alone time, independence, and privacy as situations change.